Welcome back again. And before we begin the next session, which is on the socialist response to the economy, the current economic crisis, we've just got a small poem by Kevin Higgins, a very appropriate one about how to survive this winter.
Hi, I was asked someone suggested I should write a poem dealing with the fears that a lot of people have had about this winter, which there's been, I don't remember such dread of a winter in a long time, and people dreading that moment where they have to turn the heat on. And so I wrote this, and I think it should be, today is the budget in Ireland. I think if the Irish government or the British government did want to put this on their websites as advice to people, I'd be willing to give it to them free. How to survive this winter. Turn off the heat. Instead, warm yourself by setting fire to your free weekly copy of the Galway Advertiser. Be sure and arm yourself with extra by liberating them from your neighbours' letterboxes. Sit in the dark, preferably alone, so you don't spread the pox to anyone else, wearing a cheap pair of unsustainable sunglasses. They're the only luxury we'll allow you. Get extra underwear second-hand from your local mortuary. I hear they plan to start selling them out of the back of the hearses for which they can no longer afford petrol. There are bargains to be got. Exercise personal responsibility. Begin eating spiders, dandelions, and for calcium, eat other's toenails, but only as a weekend treat. The notion of eating each day is a pre-war social construct. Spend the October bank holiday rolled up in an old carpet, and Christmas writing limericks. There was a young man from Killiney whose plans for world domination were stymied. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Reality there. Okay, so we now move on to our next session on the cost of living crisis. And we've got two guests joining the discussion. They're coming into our studio. And I'd like to welcome Michael Roberts and Peter Kennedy. Michael and Peter are very unusual people. First of all, they're socialists and they're economists. And secondly, they are able to explain the way that the capitalist system works in normal everyday language. Economics is a mystery to many people, and in the current crisis, that sort of mystification has really been piled on. So when, for example, the newspapers and the BBC are full of talk about the crisis in the markets, lack of confidence, fiscal tightening, the need for balanced budgets and so on, or even the relationship between wage increases and rising prices, we're often given very simplistic and in fact deliberately, I think, obscurantist explanations. So today we've got two comrades to come and discuss these issues. When we planned this session, we thought of it very much in terms of the type of strike wave that was occurring over the summer, and in particular the response of politicians to workers demanding that wages keep up with price increases, not wage increases, but just simply standing still in many cases. But of course the events of the last few days, particularly since Friday, with the fiscal event, the mini budget, the reaction of both speculators and other sections of the capitalist economy, have really brought this home. So we'll begin with Michael Roberts, and Michael will outline some of these issues, and then we will be followed up by Peter Kennedy. Okay, so we now hand over to Michael.
Well, thank you, Chair. I hope my mic is working fine. I've had a bit of problems in previous presentations. So it is good and clear. That's good to know. And also, I hope you're not hearing too much. My neighbour has decided to cut his lawn for the last time before the winter, and he's blasting away behind this computer I'm looking at. So hopefully that will not cut across the sound. And as the chair has said, we've had a tumultuous period in 2022, particularly since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen this huge rise in energy and food prices globally, and the impact on inflation in general. And what are the consequences of this and the policies that should be adopted to deal with it? Both what is the government doing, what are our Labour leaders suggesting, and what are a socialist alternatives? So I'm going to try and cover all those items. It's not going to be easy in the time available. And in the case of Michael Roberts, he always lands us with loads of slides to look at. I shall post the slides onto the chat later on so that people can review them after my presentation. But in order to kick off, then I'm just going to start by sharing these slides with you, if I can do this successfully. That's the wrong one. Let's try again. I'll stop the share for a second while I just sort this out. That's the one. Okay, so that's my simple title, Energy, the Cost of Living and the Current Slump. I hope you guys can see that clearly enough. Let me start by looking at where we are with inflation at the moment. This is a graph showing the whole of the inflation rate for the whole of the OECD economies. That's really the top 26 economies in the world. And as you can see, it's not just the UK that is suffering for a sharp rise in inflation, but all countries, all the major capitalist economies are seeing a big rise in inflation, something we've not seen for probably coming on 40 years. The dark line is the headline figure, the dotted line is the core one. That's removing food and energy. But even there, we can see that inflation is picking up right through the economy in general, more than doubling in most cases. And it's even worse in the case in the UK compared to other G7 economies. The Bank of England, until the price cap decision by the new government came in, was forecasting inflation to reach 13% next month, and possibly even higher. Citibank and other investment banks are forecasting even higher figures based on the wholesale gas prices, which were applying just a few weeks ago, up to 18% or even 22% year-on-year rise in inflation by the time we get to next April. So that real incomes for the average household are going to drop by at least nearly 4% across the next year. And over 2 years, that would be the weakest position for household income that we've ever had on record in the UK. Other ways of looking at it, the Resolution Foundation points out that the set fall will be a shocking 10% in real incomes over 2 years. That will leave the average worker almost £13,000 a year worse off by 2026 than otherwise would have been the case if it hadn't been for this inflationary spiral and the decline in general growth. This is going to be the biggest fall in household disposable income for over 200 years. That demonstrates the shocking situation, as the chair was pointing out, and Kevin in his poem was pointing out, the situation facing the average household for working people in the UK over the next 2-3 years. And it's hitting the poorest the hardest. Over 40% of UK households will not be able to heat their homes properly in January if energy prices stay at the levels that they are now. That's about 28 million people and in 12 million homes. And roughly 9 million of those won't be able to, from next month when the price rises come through, will not be able to maintain a warm, dry home unless the cap is sufficient to reduce the prices. But I'll come to that in a minute. The right-hand graph shows you the difference in impact for the richest group of income earners, which is the blue dots, and the poorest of income earners. You can see that most countries see a suffering in real incomes for everybody, whether they're rich or poor, but the gaps between rich and poor, the blue and the orange dot, are very tiny. In the case of France, it's a low impact on cost of living hit to incomes by both for the rich and the poor. But if you go down the bottom of that chart, you can see the gap. The UK has quite a high hit for the rich households, 5% fall, but for the poorest households, it's close to 15%. Look at the huge gap there. Only Estonia, tiny Estonia, matches that. That shows the level of inequality which exists in the UK at present. And here is the figure which it's really staggering to see the impact of energy prices and bills that we have on most households over this period coming up now. A massive increase in household spending on education, on energy, which this is prior to the price cap proposals by the government, and so it will probably be a bit lower, but we'll come to that again in a minute. Nevertheless, and this is the point to be made, you can see that average expenditure was around about, in real terms, £1,000 a year. Even if it doesn't hit 6,000, it's already up to £2,000, and the cap at 2,500 the government proposes means that we've had more than a doubling in household spending and energy, even if that cap is kept to. So real incomes are diving everywhere. Household incomes crashing worldwide. It's a worldwide figure, not a UK one, which demonstrates how severe the hit is, not just to the UK, but to all the major economies, particularly in the poorest parts of the world, as a result of the rising inflation and the failure of wages and other incomes to keep up with that. So we're going to have energy poverty. This is a new phrase that is developed, not just poverty in general, but the poorest risk spending half their income on energy in the UK if these prices are maintained. And the proportion of people living in absolute poverty will rise due to energy and other inflation prices from 17% to 20% in the UK, and could be even higher if the prices continue to rise over next April. So this is equivalent to an extra 2.3 million British people, an extra 700,000 children living in poverty by the time we get to next April. There's a quote here from The Guardian, which I found shocking. The child would tend to eat out of an empty lunchbox because they did not qualify for free school meals, but they didn't want their friends to know there was no food at home. That's the situation that applies now to an increasingly large number of children and the poorest in our community at the moment. So what is the government's plan to solve this issue? The first thing is to say they're just basically going to spend a load of money to allow energy firms to keep their prices where they keep their profits and their revenues where they are. And they're going to cap the price, the average bill at 2,500 for up to 2 years, depending how long that's necessary. And that means, still means that energy prices, this is the point I think we must emphasize, will still be more than double the level that they were at the end of 2021, even with the price cap. And the rich households are the ones who gain most from this price cap. The richest tenth will gain 4,700 in help from the government, while that's the poorest tenth will get less than half that, despite being more exposed to heating problems than the richest tenth. So 4 million families who are on prepayment meters, who are not on direct debit, not on any other way except to pay as they go, will be hit even harder by even with the price cap in place. Yes, we get the energy bill discount next month, apparently, of £400, which will be spread over 6 months. But when that expires, the prices will return, will be wherever they are next April and still be way higher than they were last April. And there's no other sign of improvement in terms of lump sum help with energy bills. And basically what we're getting then is a huge spending being given by government to the energy companies to keep their revenues. And at the same time, the Bank of England is going to introduce very cheap emergency loans. Nobody else gets this, but big business and other banks and energy companies to help businesses survive. It's a blank check, really, on future gas prices. And I'll come to what that means for the economy if I've got the time. So there's no windfall tax on energy companies. Energy companies' profits are not going to be taxed any extra they've got. And all this will be paid for coming from the public purse through borrowing. So that almost certainly means that the Bank of England will be forced to hike interest rates even more. They're already gone up now to nearly 3%. There's talk today in the markets that by this time next year, they'll be closer to 6%, doubling the interest rate at the basic level. That means a huge increase in debt servicing, not just for the government, but also for industry and households in borrowing costs. What can we do about this? Well, the TUC did propose an alternative to what was being proposed by the government. They say that we should bring into public ownership the energy retailers, the big five companies, at a very small cost because their stock market prices are very low. And we could then, the government could then organise, as it should, the energy retail prices themselves and work, and also introduce much more clearly tariffs to aim to boost the renewable part of the energy supply, and also reduce the cost per unit for high consumption households, and in particular those at low income levels. That's the TUC proposal, which I think is certainly a progressive step forward. But is it enough? Not in my view, because what it leaves out is that the energy industry is not composed of just the five big companies that you get a bill from your energy. It's also composed of a whole range of distribution companies who supply the gas and electricity down the pipes and down the lines, and they charge the retail companies as a markup, an equivalent of 45% for their services. And behind them, of course, are the massive multinational fossil fuel companies like Shell, BP, and the American companies and so on, who have been making huge profits out of the big rise in oil and gas prices. In the first 6 months of this year, the energy producers made an adjusted profit combined of nearly $100 billion. I mean, BP made $11.5 billion in one quarter, Shell $17 billion, ExxonMobil another $12 billion, and so on. So in the first 6 months of this year, that's the level of extra profits that the energy producers have made. Nothing is being done to reduce that, to take control of that. Without control, both of the distribution companies in the UK, and in particular the energy producers who provide our gas and electricity production for use, if we don't have control over those and to reduce their profits, set their investment program and so on, then we don't really have any control over the energy structure in the UK economy. And that, of course, has been left out by everybody. Now, I just want to switch to another point, which is that if we've got this inflation rise, the line of the government and, of course, the Bank of England is that we can't have wage rises matching the increase in inflation. If we do that, we're going to have what they call a wage price spiral. As the governor of the Bank of England says, I'm not saying nobody should get a pay rise. It's just that we want pay bargaining under control, otherwise inflation will be out of control. But of course, this is really nonsense because wages have been way, way behind the inflation increases for a long time. And in fact, the share of wages in national income has been declining for decades. What we've not seen is the ability of workers to be able to maintain their real incomes. And as I pointed out in the earlier graph, in fact, we are now in a position where real incomes are falling for the greatest and longest period of time for 200 years. And yet the governor of the Bank of England does not want workers to increase their wages to match that. He didn't mention, of course, what about all the profits that the big producer companies and distribution companies are making in the energy sector? Apparently, they aren't causing inflation. It's only the possibility of workers demanding wages to match inflation that would cause a spiral. But actually, if we think about it, the inflation is taking place not because of excessive spending by consumers or companies investing heavily. In fact, quite the reverse. We've seen very poor investment by companies in Britain. It's taking place because of a huge supply chain blockage, partly as a result of COVID lockdowns and the capitalist economies around the world not recovering in trade and distribution of resources and goods and services, but also because productivity growth is so poor in most capitalist countries that they're unable to respond to a recovery in demand as we came out of the COVID slump. So supply shortages remain strong, productivity growth is low, particularly in the UK, and companies are maintaining huge profits. Profit margins have hardly fallen. The level of profits continues to increase. That's where the inflation figure comes through. And nothing can be done about that inflation increase just by hiking interest rates and trying to reduce demand, as the Bank of England and other central banks are trying to do. So what we've got a policy offered to us is a price cap by the government and faster and larger increases in interest rates by central banks in order to they claim to control inflation. But in fact, what it will do is squeeze workers' incomes even more and have little or no effect upon reducing inflation and thus push the economy, not only the British one, but the world economy, into a slump. And yet we have a situation now where the Tory government policies, which are then outlined now to solve this problem of tax cuts, which I'll come to briefly, what are they doing about the low productivity that exists, particularly outside London? What are they doing about the huge rise in NHS waiting lists that have doubled since 2014? And what are they doing about the rising and really grotesque inequality which exists in the UK? There was a recent report which showed that the average Slovenian household will be better off than the average British household by 2024. And the average Polish family, who in past used to come to the UK to try and get a better income, will actually be ahead on average than a British family will be by 2024. What a condemnation of the last, not only the last 10 or more years of Conservative government, but even before that. So the government solution is what they call trickle-down economics, or they don't like to call it, but they say, give the rich households and businesses a load more money by cutting their taxes, and then they will spend and invest and take us all up. So all boats will rise with the tide due to the largesse of the rich spending more either in consumer goods or in investment. But no, there is no evidence that any of these tax cuts will achieve that. First of all, they all go to the very rich. You can see on this chart from Resolution Foundation that it's the very richest who are going to gain the most from the cuts in dividend tax, in income rate tax, and the basic rate, and in abolishing the social care levy, which was proposed by the previous Conservative government. And empirical evidence shows, this graph I won't explain very deeply, but if there was a close relationship between cutting corporate tax and business investment, then you would expect to see a graph with a line running from the top left to the top right. But that's not exactly what you're getting at all. What you're getting is the opposite, a completely flat graph, which tells you that it has little or no impact cutting corporation tax, and yet the government believes that this is the case. Business is much more concerned about their own profitability, about the ability to get cheap labour, to be able to employ technology effectively. If you like, reducing all the regulations, they're quite keen on that, which the government proposing. But corporation tax cuts are already in the UK, one of the lowest in the world. You can see the UK mark there at just above 15%, compared to France at over 30%. Britain already has a very low corporation tax, so this is going to have little or no impact whatsoever. And yet all this spending which the government is proposing is going to increase government debt dramatically. If we add all together the energy price cap, if it lasts 2 years, with the interest rate rises and these permanent tax cuts, over 400 billion increase in borrowing in the coming years. Well, some on the left argue, well, it doesn't matter if we borrow more money, we can run a huge deficit. Well, of course, that's true as long as two things happen. First of all, it doesn't hit the value of the pound against other currencies because foreigners withdraw their investments in the UK, and that it's actually invested productively to raise employment, growth and investment in technology and so on. But of course, most of this money is not going to be used for that purpose at all, but simply to help the rich improve their and maintain their profitability and their inequalities go over the next few years. So I would say that if we get to a general election within the next 2 years, it's very likely that this policy will be reversed, if not before, by the next, seeing the Tories win the next election, and there'll be massive, huge spending cuts to come, with probably the aim of wiping out the NHS altogether and introduce market charging for just about everything in the public sector. And already the government is talking about ending its target of net zero on climate change in order to sustain energy prices and provide resources in that area, that through fossil fuel. So this is the prospect which we have from this huge increase in debt and from the tax cuts the government is proposing. Just think what the impact will be. As I said, if foreigners, Mark Carney once said that Britain depends on the kindness of strangers. Mark Carney, the ex-Bank of England governor, Britain depends on the kindness of strangers. And the strangers are the foreign investors. And that if they think that the UK economy can't cut the mustard, then they will start withdrawing their investment funds. And that will bring a decline in the UK sterling against other currencies. If UK sterling falls dramatically, which of course it has over the last couple of weeks, that merely increases the import prices and widens the deficit that we have on our trade with other countries. And you can see that the deficit of the current account is around 8% of GDP. There's a record high deficit, the trade deficit following it down, as basically exports are not matching imports by any stretch of the imagination. And even with a devaluation of the currency, that will only improve it marginally, while the price of imports in dollar terms and other currencies, because the pound is falling, will rise sharply. And we can see that the pound has collapsed against the dollar and other currencies, but particularly against the dollar over the last year to a level that we've not seen really on record before, nearly down to parity with the dollar. Of course, most of us don't go on holiday to the US, but if you did, it's going to be extremely expensive in this next year. But even if it's not a question of holidays, it's a question that British businesses will have to buy goods in dollars, and it's going to cost them huge amounts of money compared to where they were before. And generally, that means a cut in the ability of business in the UK to invest. And this is all part of the collapse which exists in relation of the UK economy relative to other economies. Finally, Chair, I just want to make the point about where we're heading worldwide. Remember the global picture. Don't just consider the British picture. Remember the global picture. The IMF says the global outlook has darkened since April. The world is teetering on the edge of a global recession only 2 years after the last one. And I think that all the forecasts are now suggesting that world GDP growth is going to drop hugely, the biggest drop in 80 years from 2021 to 2023. And that while at the same time, inflation rates are going to stay much higher than they were before the pandemic, even if they come down from 8, 9, 10% where they are now to 5, 6%. As we go into 2023, world growth is going to be down very low. Just yesterday, the OECD said down to as low as 2% a year. Considering that population growth is taking place all the time, in order to maintain income per head globally on average, then you need more like a 4% growth rate. And we're going to have a 2% growth rate in the world. So per capita income, that's income per person in the world, is going to decline sharply next year. We're heading for recession in 2023. The World Bank is warning of a global slump as central banks raise their interest rates to try and combat inflation. And the world's 3 largest economies are all slowing very sharply. And so an even moderate hit to the global economy in the next year will tip it into recession. And even without a slump, growth rates are now going to be much lower than they were even before the pre-pandemic. Anybody who's seen the figures before the COVID pandemic slump will know that growth rates were slower than they were before the Great Recession of 2008. So we've had a long period of very low growth rates between 2010 and 2020. Then we had the COVID slump. And now we're going to have growth rates even slower than that as we go through the rest of this decade. It shows that the capitalist economy is failing to provide the needs of the world's population, particularly, of course, in the global south, but also in the global north. What are the alternatives? Well, immediately, a windfall tax on energy companies seems to me a no-brainer. Why is this not being applied? And as I say, public ownership of the energy companies is crucial to be able to reorganize the energy industry away from marginal pricing and speculation in fuels and fuel prices and food prices, to control that in a proper way, and also to begin to continue the process of phasing out fossil fuel production and further investment in renewables. We need to bring the Bank of England back under democratic control. We must stop this independence, which allows them to pump up interest rates in a completely vain task of trying to control inflation, only to hit the standard of living for everybody around. Why are not the big banks under our control so that we can use the financial resources to help households and not big business alone? And we need, as the Labour conferences partially agreed, to bring into public ownership some key public services in this country, the railways, the utilities, in my view, British Telecom, BA and Big Pharma. The Labour leaders have announced the National Wealth Fund, but it's tiny as a process of public investment, only 8 billion, I believe. That's way, way less, for example, than the Corbyn-McDonnell measure proposed when they were in the leadership of the Labour Party. This is a feeble attempt to reverse the failure of British capitalism. We need a national plan for public investment in the key areas of our economy so that they meet social need. And it's not just a national policy. We need a global plan for energy and the climate to steer investments towards what society does need, like renewable energy, organic farming, public transportation, water systems, public health, quality schools around the world, not just for the richest part of the world, for the rest. We need to shift the resources out of useless and harmful production in the global north to develop the global south and build basic infrastructure. If we're talking about levelling up in the UK, we also need to remember we need to level up globally, and that requires a socialist program based on public investment and common ownership. Only such a global plan can bring workers fully into employment and reduce the closure of unnecessary and wasteful industries. That must be the task for us all.
Well, thanks, Michael. Some good facts and figures, some good arguments there. And I particularly like the way you put the current British situation in a world context in terms of the world capitalist economy. And particularly your closing points about the need for the global solution, as it were. The capitalist economy links the whole world, and merely taking one country and one economy isn't going to be the solution. Indeed, we can see that with the movements against the pound at the moment. I'm now going to call in Peter Kennedy for his contribution, and we hope just to have some moments at the end for a few questions, which I'll put to the panelists. But now just call in Peter Kennedy, if you'd like to come in now, please.
Hi, folks. Thanks for inviting us today. Okay, I might cover similar ground, obviously, but not in the kind of numbers that Michael has provided today, which were very insightful. I'm going to kind of tease out, the class dimensions as well within accumulation, because, Michael's pointed out what we need is a socialist plan, and gone into a little bit of detail around the mechanics of that. It's always the question of like who's implementing the plan and what kind of plan it is, how it's democratic and so on. But these all imply that we factor in, class into the kind of analysis. So the purpose of my talk is to address the underlying cause of the cost of living crisis, and by addressing the crisis as a contradiction in the commodity form, by revealing how the contradiction is central to the present form of capitalist accumulation. And this brings in a class dimension, when we judge the success or failures of capitalism, it's in profitability, but also how it contains labour. And then we'll move on to how this commodity form contradiction illustrates how the cost of living crisis, a number of key immediate and underlying causes. And both immediate and underlying causes relate to an ongoing failure in the engine of capitalism to raise profitability in a form that contains the development of the working class as a countervailing movement towards a different kind of society. So, and finally, I'll suggest that finance capital is at the back of this, feasting on speculative profits and a system, a form of accumulation over the past 30 years or so, which is based on the super exploitation of the global labour power, declining rates of profits, and speculative investment, yet lacking the dynamism to raise the rate of profit, through investment. So in about 20 minutes, I'll try and work my way through this, and as I say, some of it will be. So the cost of living crisis, it really is a term. I've tried to angle it around across the cost of living crisis. It's a term that's been with us, obviously, for quite a long time. It's a long duration. And, it's a chronic experience for the working class in the past 30 years or so of a form of accumulation which came into being after the defeat of the working class in the 70s and 80s struggles in the UK and across the world. So, but it came into public discourse, if you like, around 2015, and that's as a result of, debt, but also, more lately because of the inflationary pressure. So I suppose the cost of living crisis is a chronic one, which has become acute with the inflation crisis. And, the crisis is a chronic one. Has been with us for decades, but has become more acute. There's deep roots in the capacity of capital to accumulate on the basis of cheap money, low inflation, low interest rates, but most of all, cheap labour. And if you look at, Mike's given us some figures there. I'll just emphasise them by saying that I'm not going to smash it over the head with them, but in the UK, 65% of the workforce are in poverty, and workers as a whole have had to lean on a mountain of personal debt, which echoes what Michael's been saying here. At the moment, 2 trillion worth of debt, which is about the GDP of the UK, and that's risen 4 times just by the year 2000. So, the reality is that this global form of accumulation we have with us today, which is kind of petering out, it's breaking down, is based on wage suppression and the intense exploitation of labour, and debt is integral to this. One thing about debt is that you have to kind of, to meet people's needs, to meet our needs, then we have to have effective demand. In other words, the money to pay for it. So capitalism makes the rules on how we can gain access to our needs through the monetary system, through wages. So, so the contradiction of the commodity form, which I think is really important to kind of like emphasize in this, because it's working its way out into all that data and the manifestations of crisis. And, the contradiction of the commodity form are that the social wealth that we create is colonized and transformed, as we know, into commodities as containers of surplus value, which is convertible into monetary profit for capitalists. Simple as that. We make commodities as use values. That's converted into as containers of surplus value, not meeting social needs. That's not the direct purpose of capitalist production, but is converted into monetary form for capitalists to profit from. So, and this kind of contradiction, if you like, between value and social need is also the wellsprings of class struggle, as we know. It's endemic to all class struggle. It's the pivot on which class struggle develops over the commodity form and the surplus product that's produced by that. Should it meet people's needs? Should it meet profitability? So the class struggle is driven by this contradiction. Workers aim to meet the social needs, and capitalists aim to generate endless profit. So the cost of living crisis is that our social needs depend on the capacity to convert such needs into effective demand. And as pointed out in some of the data by Michael, we can see how that is experienced in different ways in different countries at different levels of unequal access to income. So, the global, what I would probably say, global supply chain capitalism is driven by the same contradiction, and this is important because obviously, as Michael's just referred to, one of the pillars of the present inflationary spiral is the breakdown in the global supply chain. And so because it's driven by value, because it's driven by not people's needs, not the use values, but by profitability, then we get some social environmental irrationalities in the global supply chain. So it does not make sense really to fragment production as globalization does, fragment production, distribution and storage of commodities across the globe before reassembling somewhere else and finally resending them out across the globe once more to be consumed. It makes no sense when much can be done locally and sustainably, as we know. Just the damage to the environment on the shipping freight, which accounts for 70% of the movement of goods and part-finished commodities across the globe, hither and thither, accounts for a massive amount of carbon release in the atmosphere. So, however, it does make perfect sense if it's all about endless profit. Global accumulation and this present form of accumulation we have with capitalism is linked by fragile chains oppressive chains between many capitalist firms, all seeking to maximize the exploitation of workers' labor power and cut costs of dead fixed capital by trimming storage, facilities, distribution, networks, going for in language of just-in-time production, leaning out. That means intensive labor exploitation and the speed of circulation of the movement of goods and capital is of more important than development of fixed capital there. And this is really important for profitability, but as I say, they're immensely wasteful for the natural environment and human resources. So, yet the consequence of this is that global supply chain capitalism is pathologically predisposed to over and underproduce, and it's this over and underproduction crisis, this kind of pathology, which is built into this kind of global chain that we now have with us today. And the large corporations stand at the head of the global chain, and they rake in through transfer price mechanisms and repatriation of profits. They rake in enormous amounts of profit, and they stand at the head of the global chain. And they are finance capital. They have been well and truly colonized by finance capital. And if you look at the figures for investment in these global chains, in the big corporations, then you'll see that of the operating surpluses, then relatively small amounts go back into investment, and lots of it go into the stock market to buy back shares or pay big dividends out to its mates in the financial community, and or go into debt by buying bonds and to fuel the buybacks and the dividend payouts. So so it's created kind of like a world whereby not only are profit rates kind of like hampered by this, but also it's a world which is, as I say, pathologically disposed to over and over accumulation. So why this is because it's a form of accumulation based on the overexploitation of labor power and the driving down of wages, sometimes below value and often just on value, the over-reliance on the speed of circulation and aversion to the formation of fixed capital, and therefore is subject to chronic low-lying rates of profit and prone to amassing speculative source of profit. So hence, any political and economic shocks of immediate consequences that we've seen in the supply chain. And so, and this invokes inflation. In 2008, it was the opposite. It was overproduction because, as the system went into contraction, then there was a drop-off in demand, and that led to an overproduction of commodities worldwide and a backlog in dockyards and in storage facilities and so forth. So there's no overproduction. In this crisis, the immediate cause of the inflationary crisis is the opposite, an underproduction in terms of the undersupply, a scarcity of supplies being able to be processed from production through the distribution and retail to consumption. So the above leads us to consider the key immediate causes. The immediate causes of what is an acute stage of the cost of living crisis, which is based on this dramatic surge in inflation that Michael's provided figures on. So, excuse me. So we know that it's got a number of drivers amplifying, and the first one is the surge in demand across OECD economies post-pandemic for commodities after coming out of the lockdown, coming up, should we say, against the contradictions of the ability to supply that, but also China's continuing lockdown, which is accelerating the shortage in supply too. And on top of that, we have the geopolitical conflict, short-term, possibly short-medium term, with the Ukrainian-Russian war, which is kind of like reduced the global market and the global supply of key goods, key commodities in energy, oil and gas, and in food supply, grains. And if you just take like Russia and Ukraine jointly, their supply of grain is 25% of the global market, and so there's that bears some that reduces the amount and raises the price, and but it leads to kind of a contraction of access to global trade routes too, and to docks as the whole thing becomes politicized and restrictions of access there. And this is amplified as well by the perhaps longer term growing schism between US imperialism and China, which is impacting on the global reach of capital. And alongside the more organized Chinese working class, relative real wages rising there, putting a dent putting a dent in driving profitability from cheap, depoliticized labor. So, China's a problem. American imperialism, it's jockeying for power, which has taken, obviously, over the years, a more military form as its economy relatively declines. So we have these. On top of this, we have the monopoly power of the global energies, energy generators. Michael spoke of the mass profits that made there. And the combined profits of the largest energy companies in the first quarter of 2022 was $100 billion, and that's made solely on the price, on their powers to control price and take advantage of the larger price, and also our need for these essential commodities, and probably being aware that the state is going to have to come in to organise some subsidies on that, which has happened in the UK. And fourthly, there's financial speculators and ramping up prices and profits, and financial speculators in the commodity markets are backed and supported by, in terms of their buying power, institutional pension companies, insurance fund managers, and hedge funds, traders. And so if you look at any graph on the commodity prices in oil and energy and foods, and it was to give you the graph of it 1980 to the present day, then things were relatively calm between 1980 and around about 2000. And you look at from 2000 to 2022, and you can see the spikes up and down in these kind of speculations, which drive the prices down and drive the prices back up again. Only a couple of years ago, then prices in energy companies were being squeezed, and so profits. So they're making hay while the sun shines. And then lastly, the power of monopoly freightism. We can't emphasize enough that freighting is controlled by a small amount of mega corporations who control freight, and freight is 80% of how commodities are shipped around the world. And the 10 largest companies own 80% of that market, and they've extracted $80 billion of profits in 2021, which has doubled their average profits year on year between 2010 and 2022. So again, these things are amplifiers of the immediate cause of crisis. So the immediate cause, as we say, is this kind of the pathological fragility within the global, the way capital is now giving global reach to accumulate. And that's led to a pathological fragility in those chains, those links, those relationships between various capitals, and that leads to an overaccumulation crisis as a pathological potential. And these kind of shocks to the system have compounded that and raised and been a whole big part of the explanation of the inflationary rise, which has turned a chronic cost of living crisis that has been with us for quite a long time into an acute one. And but there are underlying causes of the crisis, and we go back to the fact that capitalism is a system which is based on class antagonisms. And the form that takes is in the commodity. It's wrapped in the commodity, as I say, and it's a system in which classes fight it out in terms of, from a working class point of view, what we require is the labour power that we put to use in production and in life is used in a creative way to generate our needs, our arrived at democratically arrived at needs. Whereas on the other hand, from a capitalist point of view, it's all about profit. It's all about, and that's exercised, and that ability to generate profit takes the form of the commodity. It has to, because that's the form in which the surplus is contained and circulated until it lands in the pockets and the wallets of the capitalist class. And so it's the class struggle means that capitalism accumulates and it searches for profit, but only using modes of production which contain the imminent threat posed by labour to its rule. We don't take kindly to exploitation. We live in a world that we don't feel comfortable in. We feel wretched in, sometimes working excess hours for little gain. And then for much of us, we sink into poverty while we work, and we don't want that kind of world. And it's a world created by that contradiction. And so that world needs to be contained by capital. So it can't willy-nilly just accumulate and accumulate. It has to accumulate in a way that contains the power of labour, which is capital's nemesis. And that provides the context of why we have different areas of accumulation, and why either one of them either leads to the defeat of workers or capital itself, And up to now, it's led to the defeat of workers. And so the underlying cause of crisis goes right back to 1970s and 80s, where we experienced a defeat, by capital, and capital was freed off to become global. Finance capital dominated this kind of movement, and we're reaping the rewards of that right now. In all the data that Michael has shown, these are kind of like phantom kind of trackers, if you like, ghostly trackers of the class struggle and the suppression of labour. And in the so-called era from 45 to mid 1970s, and was an era which politicised the working class across the world, in the UK as well, and that posed a threat to capital. And it took the best part of the 1980s and Thatcherism and Reaganism in the US and around the world to pull the plug basically on the kind of like form of accumulation which had taken place then, which regulated wages more, which provided the base of a welfare state and all the rest of it, which really kind of compromised the commodity form by releasing vital parts of production from the control of capital and placing them as use values to be policed by the state. That's the nature of social democracy that we came from. But nevertheless, it led to the politicisation of work, and something had to be done. And we're, at the moment, over the past 30 years, we're experiencing the results of that. And that's the underlying crisis, really. It's and if you like, at one end of the global supply chain are large, vast corporations, monopoly powers, colonized by finance capital, generating vast surpluses from the intense exploitation of labor, but saddled with trillions of dollars of debt. That's how sclerotically this system is. That those who have the most power are also the most indebted. Corporate capitalism has gone into massive debt, and I'll just say that 87 trillion worth of debt at the moment, which is almost the same as the value of world GDP. 87 trillion worth of corporate debt, and most of that. And they have a debt to surplus ratio of, well, in America it's 9, US, but around the world on average in the OECD, the big economies, it's 6 to 1, the surplus ratio of debt to surplus of 6 to 1. And at the other end, obviously, we have one thing I'll leave you with is this: is that wherever we go next, we have forecasts, but you can forget them, because part of them are putting the frighteners on governments to work overtime to do more. But what we do know is that what's different now and could threaten capitalism right now, it's high inflation, high interest rates, right? And it's the potential for workers to use the context to begin to forge a labour movement. And that's why there's going to be a recession if that continues. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Michael, for two very excellent contributions, different aspects, I think, of the same issue. And I was particularly pleased at the way that both comrades brought in the class struggle and really focused on the issue of exploitation and profit. The word exploitation is very rarely heard on the BBC, and the cost of living crisis is often portrayed as some sort of natural phenomenon that has got little to do with the nature of capitalism, and Peter's emphasis on the pathology of capitalism and its drive for accumulation and exploitation of the working class, I think was very good, and that, I think, is a good starting point. What I'd like to just do to sort of round up is to ask both of the speakers. I'll start with Michael. The same question, so a couple of minutes, Michael, if you can. I think I know the answer, but maybe you'd like to correct me. I wonder if you'd like to comment on Labour's economic proposals and what you think the impact will be in terms of the capitalist crisis, and maybe how that stands in relation to, you know, established bodies of capitalist thought. I'm thinking particularly of the reaction of certain sections of the capitalist media and indeed the markets to Kwarteng's mini budget. And it does seem that it's not just a case of taking a profit, but there does seem to be an argument that it, from the point of view of British capitalism, that it's actually a disastrous policy. So I wonder if, Michael, if you could comment on that just for a few moments.
Well, thank you, Chair. I mean, if you look at the media reaction to the mini budget presented by Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor, or Kamikaze, as we like to call him now, his position was, it's interesting, you take the Daily Express and Daily Mail, they think it's an absolutely fabulous decision on the part of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to cut taxes across the board, deregulate the economy, introduce deregulated industrial zones all over the place where businesses don't have to worry about not only environmental conditions, but labour laws and anything, proposals to abolish the EU basic minimum regulations on hours and so on. All these measures are fabulous news, says the Daily Express, and it doesn't matter about the huge deficit which the government is going to generate as a result of borrowing. It reminds, I just imagine if Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister now, and he was putting forward a proposal to spend a load of money on developing the economy, and he was going to run a huge deficit, I think there would almost be a counter-revolution at the doorstep of Jeremy Corbyn's house. The media will be attacking him across the board in a vicious manner for wasteful expenditure by the government. But of course, apparently for the Mail and the Express, it's okay if it's a Conservative government that's doing it. But as you say, Chair, actually the majority opinion amongst the strategists of big business and finance in the UK is a great deal of trepidation and worry about this particular programme. The idea that trickle-down economics, that cutting taxes and reducing regulations to boost the profits of the very rich and businesses will deliver a fast-growing economy of 2.5% the government hopes for, or anything like that, is just rejected by the mainstream financial experts in the Financial Times and elsewhere. They're very worried about this programme. It is, of course, a 180-degree turn from the last 10 years of a Conservative government, which says the most important thing was fiscal probity, balancing the budget. Labour could never do this. If we do that, then we can have low interest rates and growth. Now we have a programme completely the opposite. Doesn't matter about the interest rate rises. Apparently, Kamikaze said in the Groucho Club, according to Private Eye, after a recent rate rise, it doesn't matter about interest rates and it doesn't matter about the pound. That's irrelevant. The most important thing is to get the cuts in and deregulation, and that will get us the growth. This is a programme for disaster for the British economy, and is totally rejected and greeted with a great deal of ambiguous uncertainty on the part of investors. And we can see foreign investors have already made their decision. They're selling up UK assets in droves, and the pound has collapsed. So what I'll briefly outline what could be the alternative to this programme that the government's got. Just a few words on the current Labour leaders' policies, which seem, I have to say, rather limited against this absolutely grotesque and catastrophic policy being adopted by the Truss government. So take tax cuts. Apparently, we are going to, Labour is in power, we restore the top rate of tax to 45%. That's it. But we would accept the cut in the basic rate from 20 to 19%. Is there any, what are we going to do about corporation tax? Are we going to allow those taxes to go through? Are we going to impose industrial zones and the deregulation of the economy? Are we going to impose new measures against trade unions so that they cannot strike for better wages? I hear silence as far as I can see on these issues. And as for investing in the economy to make sure that it does increase employment growth and better incomes for everybody. So far, the Labour leaders have proposed a national wealth fund, which in concept is not a bad idea, but the funding of this, as I said in my presentation, is tiny. It's just nothing at all compared to the investments that the capitalist sector it must make in order to grow the economy. Just this one point, Chair. The capitalist sector in Britain invests about 15% of GDP. The business sector of that capitalist sector, if you take out finance and property, only invests just over 10% of GDP. But public investment is as low as 2% in GDP in the UK. And that investment is mainly on things not to boost the economy, but just to maintain certain levels of what existing conditions that we have at the moment. So it's 5 times larger. The capitalist sector decides the issue of whether this economy is going to grow. If they don't invest, then we don't get growth, we don't get better employment, better wages, or workers can't even fight for them because the capitalist sector is so weak. And that's the ratio. But nothing is proposed to take over. What we need is replacing the capitalist sector with public investment under democratic control by workers. And that means bringing into the major strategic sectors of the economy, bringing them into public common ownership, particularly the banks. Yes, railways. Yes, the Royal Mail. Yes, the water utilities. But what about the banks? The banks are remaining completely in control of the capitalists and their strategic interests. And they will operate in their interests, not in the interests of the people as a whole. Until we have a clear program to transform society in a socialist direction and a program that's adopted by the Labour leaders, then we're just going to be following the coattails of this disastrous Conservative government, if how long ever it lasts.
Well, thanks, Michael. And just now, Peter, maybe if you'd just like to add a few final closing comments to sum up both what you've said and what Michael has said, and particularly point out, how you sort of see a perspective for the way forward, just in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think, the perspective for the way forward is, is really for workers. And, we know what we're going to get from capitalists. And the Labour Party's historic role, particularly over the past 50 years, has been to replace the Tories because they look like a safer pair of hands. And that's usually because the Labour Party has got more leverage with the Labour movement, and so. But the problem that Labour's got is that it's already saying that coming to terms with Blairism again and those kind of things. So its direction is not going. Well, if it gets power, it's not going to do anything about the financial situation or the power of finance. And we're just seeing what happens to, in the case of the UK with the Tories, what happens if you disagree or make a wrong move policy-wise, and how that's reacted to in terms of global finance. So I think there's big issues, and Labour's not going to be able to deal with that because it's going to try and marry the interest of capital with Labour, but in a kind of very perverse form, given the context that we're in now. And I think from a worker's point of view, it's always been, Marx once said, what's the secret of any society and its control? It's the form in which the surplus is pumped out of the direct producers, i.e. workers. And so we have to control the surplus, really. And we can do that from the top and the bottom. The only thing we can do really is workers take control over the organisations which produce and distribute goods, so that the criteria is their socially useful need and not value. And at the top, we control and we vanquish really finance capital and replace them with investment banks. And, workers should be working towards that and pushing the politics towards that. Labour's going to come in and it's going to grab balanced budgets. It's going to manage the debt, the budget, public sector debt and borrowing in line with the needs of, without spooking the financial community. So, it's all about workers begin to mobilise and taking the reins of power from capital. And if you don't do that, Labour will come in as the reserve 11 for the Tories and manage the system. And the system is crying out for change. We look at you look at a situation now where there's poor profitability, masses of financial speculation out of all control of the so-called real economy, and so, the system's crying out for change, and it's crying out for, and that change could come in terms of finding a new way of accumulating, but that requires the containment of labour on terms different the way they've contained it in the present, which is to atomise politically labour, fragmented across the world in terms of in terms of like the smaller production units globally, and then super exploit labour. But that comes at a price. Comes at a price particularly because capitalists need labour to consume the massive products that they're producing, and so the more you go that way, the more you make pathological the under and overproduction problems. So capitalism wants a solution, but it doesn't look like it's getting anywhere near it. And that's why the power of finance capital will grow unless workers do something about it. Labour is a fly in the ointment of this, the Labour Party. It's we need to bypass the Labour Party. It'll ruin us all.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Thanks to both comrades for their contributions, and I think really giving us some good arguments and some good analysis, and particularly Peter's final point there about the need for the working class to be the ruling class, to organise production for need, not for profit. I think that was a really strong message that came through from both comrades. Okay, we've another short interlude now, another poem from Kevin Higgins, and this one's called Fixing the National Discourse.
Okay, I wrote this poem about 3 years ago, and it was in response to one of these online outrage sessions where a writer had written an article in the Irish Times questioning the kind of very narrow idea type of identity politics and the focus on language over the structure of society and so on. So I wrote a satire on the people who attacked him, and this is called Fixing the National Discourse. When each adjective, noun, verb and swear word has been put through the purifying machine, we're perfecting those found wanting, abolished by our all-conquering delete button to safeguard our newfound purity. It will be compulsory for urban district councils, kindergartens, universities, and non-gubernatorial organisations in receipt of morbidly obese public largesse to employ a pair of performing jaws from the better bit of town as language ombudsperson and general controller of talk, to inform you when you're saying it wrong and send the offending X words down the U-bend where they belong. It will be an offence persecutable under law to use the K word, the D word, or the R word, even in the privacy of one's own mind, except for the purpose of historical study of the political and linguistic degeneracy of the recent past. Civil servants will be made read enough Foucault so they never inadvertently commit a hate crime while typing the now traditional letter of refusal in response to applications for housing, healthcare, welfare. Furthermore, mention of Led Zeppelin will heretofore be prefaced with the health warning quartet of toxic masculinity, and use of the phrase beautiful blue eyes accepted as proof of closet membership of the Ku Klux Klan by our new non-jury online courts, as well as having no effect whatsoever on actual living, breathing inequality and hatred, for which it'll be business as usual. These measures will help us attract increased foreign direct investment into our seething little country. In 5 years, 90% of you will be working 12 jobs and paying twice your monthly income to rent a shed with a tin roof from the love child of Google and the ThyssenKrupp Corporation, and be so grateful you won't dare spit a nasty word against anyone.